Welcome to the workshop. This is me. Here's some objectives. That should get the recording up to date, I think, right? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, fake Kevin.
That's what I'm here for.
All right. So we're going to get some comfort. Oh, I can't believe I failed. I can't believe I forgot the red button. That is embarrassing.
I'm texting Kevin now about that.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to get yelled at. All right. So really, this could be the only slide for the next 45 minutes. Knowing the technical bits of the configuration system mean nothing if you don't have a good process around it. The technical parts of configuration system, the import, the export stuff, again, means nothing if you're the only one on your team using it. So this is more about process. Using the configuration system successfully is about having a good process in place to use the configuration system. I've worked with organizations that have, 3 or 4 person development team, and one person's like, I'm going to use a configuration system. I'm like, great, what about everybody else? Because if it's only you, you're not going to have a good time. You're going to get burned at some point. So, other than that takeaway, there's 2 other takeaways. Well, this is kind of the same one. 75% of using it successfully is process. And I'm going to talk about that process. I'm going to give you some tips and bits and pieces in here. The technical part, I'm going to explain the technical part to you today, and you're going to understand it. It's not super technical. It's not super difficult to follow. That's the easy part. Getting buy-in on your team and everyone else, that's the hard part. Number 2, it's all or nothing. Features in Drupal 7. You create a feature to manage part of your site. A new content type and a view and maybe a text format or something over here. That feature only controls that slice of your site. In Drupal 8, the configuration system manages all of your site configuration. You can't say, I only want it to manage my content type configuration. It's all or nothing. When we use the drush commands to import or export configuration, it's importing all the configuration or exporting all the configuration. So we're going to come back to this a few times today. And the reason for this is, now that we're in Drupal 8 land, it's a word that we hear a lot more in Drupal 8 land than we did in Drupal 7 land, dependencies. There's a lot of dependencies in configuration, so if you try and be clever and only pull in some configuration, if you screw that up and that configuration is dependent on another configuration, poof, your site, goes down. So, all or nothing. All right, so let's get down to kind of basics here. We know that, hopefully we know that, when you are in the UI of the admin UI of your Drupal site, one of the main things you do is you add content. Content, add, article, type, hit save, get saved in the database. Hopefully we all know that that's what happens. How about when you go to add a new field to a content type? I need to create a new Boolean, it's a checkbox, it's got this label, it's got this help text, hit save. That's configuration. Where does that go? That goes in the database. So the Drupal database is not a content database, it's a content and configuration database. And there's some dependencies there obviously, right? If you have the example I always use in almost every class I teach is like rebuilding imdb.com. Everyone understands movies. You have a movie content type. And how do you describe a movie? All kinds of fields. Well, if you add a new field to a content type, and then you add data to that field, that data, that content, is dependent on the configuration. So even between content and configuration, there's some dependencies there. And so that database, it's kind of a mishmash of content and configuration in there. And that's the problem that we kind of have to overcome. And then the other thing that is kind of a prerequisite for all this is, this is again, best practices, you should be working locally. Right? You shouldn't be making config changes or, God forbid, code changes on remote environments. Everybody should be working locally, and it becomes part of your process. You work locally, you commit to Git, you push code up to dev, up to test, QA, whatever, then up to production finally. And then conversely, is that my next one? Oh, going the wrong way. Yeah, up through there, So you're working locally. There's only one way to get into the repository, ideally, if you define your process as such. and then you can pull into all of your remote environments. So code flows up, data flows down. You never want to take a local, database and push that up to production. We've all done it. It's okay. I've done it. But therein lies the problem, right? Because I just said configuration is saved in the database. And I just told you have to work locally. So if you have to work locally and make config changes, and those are in your database here, and then I also told you that you shouldn't push databases up, how do you get the configuration in the database here up to these? Well, the diagram tells us. Somehow that configuration has to get put into Git. That's what the configuration system does. It takes the configuration from the database, it puts it in the file system, allows you to move configuration up and pull it in, and then there's another drush command that lets you import that configuration. So obviously if we, I probably already said this, but if you have configuration in here, you also have content in here. At the same time, folks are adding content here. You copy this database up, you're overriding content. Obviously better. Nor is it practical to take a few tables from your local database and move it up because of dependencies. And we'll just not elaborate there. So the configuration system provides a mechanism to export configuration from the database into the file system. And by file system, I'm not talking the files directory, I'm talking like code. Actually, YAML files. And then we have our pathway. We have Git. We can push it into the repo, which we're allowed to move up. So this is the one diagram. If you're going to walk away and remember one thing I said, try and remember this diagram. Because here's a typical workflow. Now here's your local database. You've added a new view to your local site. You hit the save button. It's somewhere in your local database. You run a config export command. And I'm kind of a proponent of you do this all through Drush. You can do both of these through the UI, but I think it's just a better practice to do it through Drush. But you run this command. What does this command do? I'm going to show you exactly what it does, but literally I'm going to show you tables and files and stuff, but it basically takes configuration and creates a bunch of YAML files in a special config directory. What do you do with those files? Well, you stick them in your local repository. And then you can push that repository up to a remote, just like you would a style change, a theme change, whatever, or you're adding a module. And then you pull from that remote repository into some environment. This could be test, this could be stage of production, whatever. So now you've got your new configuration sitting in files here. You're not done though, because just because the files are on the remote system, they're not in the database yet. So you've got to run this import command. So you've got to get basically the copy of the configuration from the file system into the database. So these two commands, basically are your little translators. They translate config and database to config and file system. This one's actually pretty darn simple. How many people have written a module, custom module in Drupal 8? If you have your hand raised, you could probably write the functionality of this command. And I'll show you in a few minutes why that is. This one does a bit more. This one, because a configuration change could mean you're adding a module or enabling a module. A configuration change can be a new content type with 38 fields. So when you run this, you're not just copying some YAML from files into the database. You actually have to do stuff with that configuration. You have to create a content type which involves tables and new fields and stuff. So this is kind of like this is the complex one. This is the easy one. Make sense so far? I talk fast, especially with this presentation, because there's a lot. It's dense. So just seriously, if you have a question, yell. Okay, so this is where things fall apart a lot. This is where if you're going to use a configuration system, you really have to have a process and be methodical about it. Because syncing that config, running config export, running config import, has to become part of your everyday process. Otherwise, the whole system is breaking down. when you get a new task, you sit down, you get your local development environment fired up. First thing you normally do, you make sure your code base is up to date. You do your git pull. Well, now you have to remember, okay, well, when I'm pulling in my any code updates, that could include configuration updates from that config directory. So when we do a git pull, we now also should be thinking, okay, now I have to do a drush config import. Because this could mean a configuration change is being pulled in. So we need to make sure that configuration change actually gets applied. Other direction as well. When we're working locally, we have a task to tweak a view and maybe theme it a little bit or something. Not only do we need to add and commit the theming changes, but we need to add and commit the config changes to that view. So not only do we do this, before we do that, we actually have to get that config out to the file system. So we do a drush config export, get the changes to that view into the file system, and then we can add those changes along with the theme changes and whatever else. Commit and push it up. So it's just kind of like, git pull and git add commit push, they have new buddies. They have our little config buddies now. Every time we use this, we've got to make sure we're using this as well. And if you're in a multi-branch environment, it's kind of the same way. Because when you're checking out a branch, it's kind of like a git pull, right? You're changing the code base. That code base might have different configuration. So before you change branches, you export any config. You get it committed to your current branch. Then you check out. Because when you check out, that could mean a code change. If there's a code change, you got to get that config in. Yeah, so this is from the previous slide, but that's kind of the idea. So you're kind of expanding your process. You're just tacking on some config commands to your current process. Question?
First question is, should I keep all my questions to the end of presentation?
No, I don't care. Good.
First question is, why do you need to rebase?
Okay. Because I'm anal retentive? Is that enough of it? No, this is just my habit. I always do a git pull rebase. You don't have to have the rebase. You can just do a git pull, and it might be a rebase, it might be a merge, but
second question.
That's part of me being really methodical.
Okay. So you run git and then you do drush command. Is it possible to configure your git repo so changes to the configuration are
Automatically triggered?
registered through git?
So you're talking like a hook that basically anytime you do a pull, this automatically runs?
I think I'm asking more about git ignore configuration versus git include configuration or something. Because when we work with the backdrop, I know that we make the changes, they're somehow automatically registered, and I can just commit them. Maybe it was a custom configuration, I don't know.
But automatically registered.
So if I make a change on the,
Oh, okay, I know what you're saying. Okay, as soon as you said backdrop, now I got it. Because what backdrop does, backdrop's default configuration store is the file system.
Okay.
It's not the database. So, to kind of bring this full circle, and first time I think I've ever talked about backdrop in a session, so yeah, that's kind of cool. In backdrop, when you go and create a view and hit the save button, it's not going in here.
Okay.
It's going directly in here. That's what you're talking. So,
Okay, that's why. Okay.
yes. So, the answer actually is yes. There's actually a module, I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, but it will, on any configuration change, automatically run this for you. I can look it up afterwards. I don't know if anybody else knows what it's called. I don't know what it's called, but it exists. Might be part of config suite, but okay. Okay. All right, moving on. All right, so we talked about how when you run a config export, those config files get generated, or they end up in what we call the sync directory. You can control the, I think, am I on the right slide? Yeah, you can control the location of this sync directory in the settings.php file. Anybody use the Drupal project, Drupal composer template on GitHub? If you use that template, first of all, if you're doing Drupal 8, you should be using that template, so shame on everyone who didn't raise their hand. But if you use that template, it's pre-configured so that your config directory is above the web root, where it should be. But you can put it in your files directory or somewhere. I'd keep it above the web root, but you can control the location of that in settings.php. Okay, so configuration files, we talked about kind of dependencies. If you just have a fresh Drupal 8 install, click the standard profile, hit install, there's over 170 configuration files. Right, so like every content type is a configuration file. Every field, I think, has 3 configuration files. There's a base, maybe 4. There's a base, there's an instance, there's a formatter, there's a widget configuration. Every view has a configuration file, and there's a whole bunch. So there's a lot there. And as I said, you create a view that's based on a content type, that's a custom content type. Well, that view's configuration is therefore dependent on that content type's configuration. So that's why there's all kinds of craziness. That's why we do all or nothing. So we don't have to worry about all those dependencies. Not recommended to try and be clever about it, unless you really know what you're doing. Unless you are sure that this particular configuration is not dependent on anything, nor is anything dependent on this configuration. It's just easier to do all or nothing. All or nothing. There, I said it again. Okay, live demonstration. This is now we're gonna have some fun. Here's what we have. So I normally do this with a Pantheon remote environment, but I can't because of the network and the ports blocking or something. I can't do a push. So I'm faking the whole thing. So I have the green bar. So green is our local. Everything's local, but this is really our local. Okay. So the green bars are local, and you can see. So it's just depends config. Don't ask about the name. I'll explain later. Red is our pretend remote, even though it's technically local, but it's our pretend remote. Same site, same code base. Same remote repository, just pretend this is like a test environment or QA environment. So then, over here, just because I like blasting you with colors, red, this is the command line for our remote. That's still pretty... Yeah, that look red?
Yeah.
It does?
Yes.
Oh.
As long as you're not colorblind.
Yeah, okay, well, clearly... That look green?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make that a lot bigger. So you get the colors, right? Local, red is remote. Okay. All right, so... Uh-oh, what happened? Where'd it go? There we go. All right, so let's just do a very simple kind of walkthrough. I have till, 3:15, right? 45 minutes? We're good. So let's do a very simple change. And we're going to be good. We're going to work locally. So we're just going to come to System, Basic Site Settings. And did I actually hit? I did. So let's add a new slogan, and it's going to be Woot, we're at Bad Camp 2018. That's a configuration change. It's a very simple one, but it's a configuration change. Save. So we all know, I did this on local, I hit save, it's somewhere in the database. And we can come over here and SQL Pro, oops, I have to spell pro right. This will open up my
Pancakes.
I gotta find my pancakes. That's right. There we go. I'll zoom in. I know it's really small. But if we come, this is the config table right here. Config. And then somewhere in here, if we scroll all the way down to system.site, that's something. There we go. System.site. And somewhere in here. There we go. There's our slogan. Buried somewhere deep in the database. All right, so we saved, it's in the database. So if we go back to our little diagram, so this is all we've done. Boom. It's in there. So the goal here is we've changed configuration on local, let's get that up to our remote. So we have a slogan on a remote. That's the goal here. So the first thing we have to do is we have to run our config export. So we come over here, and let me just get into the right place. And we're going to do a drush config export. Right? If you have a 13-year-old brain like I do, you use drush CEX and you say it out loud every time because it's funny. But but for teaching, I'm going to use the proper config export. And it says, okay, well, there's some differences in the active configuration. So the labeling in Drupal 8 core, I'm not super crazy about. So if you're using kind of configuration out of the box in Drupal 8, when you see the word active configuration, that's configuration in the database. All right? That's the active. That's when we do something on the site. That's where the configuration is coming from. Difference of the active configuration to the export directory. That's our sync directory. Okay? And it shows us that this is the only difference, and this is the right one, because this is where our slogan got changed. And it says, if we continue with this, the YAML files are going to be overwritten. So that's fine, because that's what we want to do. So we're going to continue with that. Okay, so here we are. So now if we do let me get out of this, get status. Hopefully we have one change. Sure enough, we have that one change. So this is kind of the crazy part. I said we could all kind of write that drush config export command, but all it does is it says select star from config for each row in config, and this is there's 3 fields here. Create a YAML file named this.yaml. Take the config in here. This is just a PHP serialized array. Convert it to YAML and stick it in the file. That's it. That's what config export does. It just takes all of this data, and if we come here, and if we go to, I know it's really small, I'm going to zoom in. Here's our config directory. Let's go to system.site. Oops, sorry. There you go. So that is that serialized PHP array converted to YAML, stuck in our file, and boom, there's our slogan. So there's nothing complicated happening yet with this config export. But what does that get us? Well, that gets us, exactly what we want. A configuration change that's been converted to code. So now we can move it up. Code flows up. So let's do that. So we can do a git add config, git commit -m, updated. Well, here. Again, best practice. Oh, shoot. Sorry. I'm going to mention later, I have gotten into the habit of doing this. When I do a commit that includes config, as part of the commit message, I say config. It kind of helps me when I look back at the history. You don't have to do it. Updated site slogan, period. All right, so where are we now? We've done this. We've done this. We're now going to stick it in our local repository. Well, now it's in here, right? So let's move it up to our remote Git repository. Git push local origin. Local origin is just it's a Git repository that's literally on this machine as well. All right, so now we've moved it up to here. So now let's go over to the remote system. And we're going to do I probably have all these, so I can probably save myself some typing. I'm going to git fetch. I do git fetch and git rebase rather than git pulls. It's just a habit. It's the same thing. So I fetched it. So now I'm going to rebase it. So all that basically does is I pulled it from here into here. So at this point, the updated config is on that server, but it's only here. It's not in the database, so if I come here and go to home, this is again my local, we're going to see obviously the slogan. But it's not on our remote yet. It's not here yet. That really does not look red from here. And that is just like jet black to me. Good golly. Maybe it's like an angle thing. I'm going to go with that. Yeah, so we have to do a config import now. So let's come over to red, and I believe it's probably just right here. If I go back far enough. Oh, here I did it that way, so let me just... I'm going to make it higher. So ignore the ddev dot stuff, that's just my local environment. I lost my cursor, anybody see it? Oh, there it is. It's just hard to see. All right, let me, that's not what I want to do. Let's just do it this way. Clear. So ignore the ddev dot. Drush, config, import. It's a lot of work to get me to zoom this in the right place. There we go. So CIM is the shortcut for that one, or the alias for that one. So drush CEX, drush CIM, if you don't want to type all that. Hit enter. Give it a second to do its thing. And the way, because I use this ddev dot, it automatically gives me a Y, but it gives me a chance to say no, but you can see this is the only difference it found. It pulled it into the database. So it basically took the changes from here and brought them into here. And then there we go. Okay, so that's the very basic use. So, we're good on time. All right, so now how do we get in trouble with this? Let's say someone's working on this dev site directly on it, and they come and they add a new content type. And it's going to be a movie content type because that's where I'm going to roll. Let's just pretend that we had a bunch of fields on it, but there we go. We now have a new content type. Well, if I flush caches, we have it. At the same time, we're going to come over to here and say, do we have a content type now? Yeah, it's down there now. So that's bad developer, right? That's the person not on board with the process, who's working directly on some remote machine. Good developers doing their job. They're like, oh, we need to, tweak. We need to add a new view, and it's going to be a view of articles. And we're just going to take all this stuff, take a bunch of default values, we're going to create a new view. So I'm doing things, for now, the right way. So at this point, that configuration's in database. So I'm going to show you, we actually have a little bit of an interface for this. We have this under configuration, development, configuration synchronization page, which is a little bit confusing. Number one, and this is one of my tips and tricks, ignore everything in yellow on this page because it's crazy town. I'm just now starting to understand why these things are listed, but don't even worry about it. Just pretend it's not there. This is all that matters. There's been a change, and it's on views, view article, right? That's the view that we just created. So here's again where things are a little bit confusing. Because it's saying that one removed. Well, that doesn't make sense. We just added it. So why is it one removed? So the way I've learned to read this page is I form a sentence. And that sentence is, if I were to click this button, then this would be removed. It's very counterintuitive. Like I couldn't come up with a better example of something that's counterintuitive than this. So the idea is that if we were to, and import all is basically the same thing as a config import. If I were to import the configuration in the file system, then this would be removed. That makes sense, right? Because, well, let's think about this. Because let's pretend we're up here just because this is where config import is. That view exists here, right? That view does not exist in the file system yet because we haven't exported it. So if we were to run import, it's all or nothing, remember? So when we run this, all of the configuration here gets swept out to C, including our view.
It's like a feature revert.
It's like a feature revert, yeah. And so all of this configuration in here gets swept out to C, replaced with the configuration in here, which does not include our view. So this page, it can be very helpful, but there's removed, there's added, and changed. You have to read them in the in my advice, the context of these is, if I click this, then this will be removed. And before I talked about that active configuration, so let me actually make one more change in my local here, just so we can have a changed one. I forgot to do that, sorry. So I'm going to do, we're at Badcamp 28, so I'll get rid of the boot, because I'm slightly less excited about it than I was 5 minutes ago. Config sync. Again, ignore all the yellow. Okay, so now we have, if I click import, this one will be changed, valid, this one will be removed. Now valid, now that we understand the context. But if we view differences, this is like the diff thing in features. Now we have active and staged. Again, we have to translate labels. I don't know why they're named. Well, I know why they're labeled this way. They're labeled this way to accommodate an edge case that no one uses, or very few people use. It'd be great if we can somehow override these easily. But active is configuration in the database. Active is what's in your database. Staged is configuration in the file system. Okay, so what's active right now? This is, we're at Badcamp. I remove the root and hit save. What's in the file system right now is the one with the root. So if I import all, this is going to replace this. Importing takes the stuff from the file system and moves it into the database. So if I were to hit import all, then we would lose this, and we go back to root. Everybody cool with that? I'm not going to do that because I'm looking at time, because what we're going to do instead, we're still being a good developer here. We haven't crossed over the dark side. I'm about to, but we're still good. So as a good developer, I'm going to do the right thing. I've done my config stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just go through this fast. I'm going to do my config export on my local. So I'm moving from the database into the file system. I'm doing git status. And we see, I know the colors kind of suck here, but it changed our system.site is our slogan. It added our views, our view. So I'm going to add that. And now I'm going to change my config or commit message. Updated site slogan and added new view. Hit enter. I'm going to push that to my repo. I'm going to move over to the dev site. I'm going to pull that change in. So now that we have pulled it in, again, we're at the situation where we have our updated config here, our new view is here, and our root list slogan is here. This is as it was. We can use the configuration, the config sync page here on the red site. So if we go to development config sync. Yeah, okay. If I hit import all, what's going to happen? We're getting a new view. I know that's small, so I can make that bigger. We're getting a new view. That makes sense, because I just created it on local. I pushed it, pulled it. We're going to go rootless on the site, but
Dun, dun, dun.
that movie content type that we created on the remote environment, that doesn't exist in our configuration directory. Oops. The movie content type exists here, because that was done directly here. It was never exported to config. There's no movie content type here. So when I do a drush config import, all of this gets swept out to C. All of this replaces it. There's no movie content type in here. So, very correctly, they will be removed. And that, in most places, is a bad thing. So we're going to do a bad thing there. So how do we avoid stuff like this? Well, as part of the process, as a good developer, I should have seen that. I should have seen that, whoa, there's outstanding config on the remote. That has to be captured and put into Git before I do config import. And that can be tricky, especially if you're pushing a lot of config up. These are very simple cases where we know that there are two, but a lot of times if you're doing content type and a view and a bunch of fields, you got a bunch of changes here. And these might just get lost somewhere in this list, or if you're in a rush or something, and you can very easily sweep them away. Let me just reload this. Now we've done a config import. So no more movie content type. And we should be rootless here, yeah. And so we're good here as well. So that losing configuration, that's the biggest hurdle with the configuration system. And it can be avoided. And it's just avoided with process. It's avoided with, number one, you shouldn't be making configuration changes on a remote environment, in my best practice opinion. But if you do, there has to be a process to capture those configuration changes into the repo. And maybe there are, and so the tricky things become like with block placement or panel layouts. Those are things that authors typically do, right? So can we expect an content author, to change a block and then hop over the command line and do some config export and get stuff? You can't really expect that. So there are some ways, there's some process ways around that. You can train your authors that when something like that happens, open a ticket for a developer to export those changes. That's number one way to do it. Number two way of doing it is you can actually you can whitelist some of that configuration so it doesn't get overridden. So that what's on the server stays, or what's on the remote environment stays on the remote environment. It's a little bit more dicey that way. Not a big fan of that way. Or my favorite way of doing it, especially with teams that are new to the configuration system, is a module called config read only. So I'm going to go ahead and enable config read only. And rather than tell you what it does, I'm going to show you what it does. So I kind of have it already configured, just for time's sake. So I'm going to install it locally. It's not going to do anything locally because I don't have it configured for local. I only have it configured for remote. I have 5 minutes, plenty of time. Do our config export. Enabled config read only. This is a contrib module, if you're curious. Okay, we're going to do our push.
I guess you should point out that you enabled a module, and that's a config change, which is why.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah. Yep. So that's yeah. Thank you, Lee. I'm sorry, fake Kevin. We're going to fetch. Go through the same process. Config import. So the module's enabled in both places. And I probably have to show you a little bit of code here. So on the really tiny, let's see, on the, we're not using Pantheon today, so I can't use my usual little block of code. I'm going to have to simplify it. So basically on the remote environment, there's actually a hard switch. Oh, you know what? I have it one line below. There's a hard switch here. You can enable the module. It's not going to do anything unless you have this settings in your settings.php. So basically what we're saying here, you can guess, we're making configuration read-only on that remote environment. That sounds scary. It's a little scary. If I come here and go to basic site settings, I might have to rebuild caches. We'll see. Now, any form, any admin UI form from core and any module that uses Drupal's configuration system, when this module is activated for that environment, you're going to see this. You cannot save this form. You couldn't change config if you tried. This button is grayed out. Click, 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 nothing.
And you would only put this on the remote.
I'd put this on remote. Yep. So what does this do? This completely insulates you from getting configuration overwritten, because it prohibits configuration from being changed. It's Thor's hammer, whatever his new thing is. I forget what it was.
Is that just from the UI?
That's a great question. I'd be willing to bet you probably, what do you think, like through Drush or through code?
Yeah.
Well, if you write it directly to the database, anything's
Well, I
possible.
mean, are you still able to push to it and whatnot?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, that's the whole thing with this, is
You don't have to disable it and then push.
no, not at all. No, there's never going to be anything on here that you have to worry about overriding, because you can't make any config changes. Yeah.
Okay, so you used the example of your content person placing a block. So the content person cannot place a block. The content person has to make a ticket. Okay, whitelist. Got it.
There's a whitelist for this module. So it's commented out here, but this is basically configurations for panels, landing pages. So this makes it so that they can, everything's blocked, everything's read-only except for panels variants. You could have block placement, block configuration, you could have whatever you want. Just gotta be careful though about that, because when you push up, you can still override it. So you do have a little bit of a loophole here, but for teams that are new to the config system, and it also requires some buy-in from the whole team. Forget about the developers, but the whole team, stakeholders. But what does it do? It's the enforcer. It enforces your process. You can say, don't make changes on production. You can say that all you want. This is like, go ahead and try. You know? All right, so let me finish up my slides and we'll get out of here just about on time. Tips and tricks. Okay, number one. I like this module. It protects me from my clients and them from themselves. It's like training wheels. If your team is new to the config system, use it. Use it for a few weeks if you have to. Use it indefinitely if you have to. I tell my clients that we have to use it. I can't turn it off. There's nothing I can do. And I mentioned this one. If config changes are made to remote, if you're not using config read-only, have a process in place, to get those config changes into the repo immediately, as quickly as possible. The longer you wait, the higher chance you have of hitting some type of Git conflict. You don't want that. So have a process for getting those config changes into Git. And this goes back to the slides earlier. When you do a pull, import config. Before you do a push, export config. Before you check out a new branch, export and commit config. After you check out a new branch, import config. Those little Git commands, they have to have their new buddy. Has to come along for the ride. So this was the same thing I just said, only for multiple branches. Yep. This is using the word config as part of your commit message. I found this extremely helpful when I go back and look at history. Like, who did that? Who do I blame? Or at what point was I blaming myself, usually? And then the yellow text on the configuration synchronization pages makes me nutty. That Just ignore it. Seriously, it will make you. You'll be looking at it saying, "I did not touch that thing," and you didn't. I don't know if it's a timestamp, but ignore the yellow text. Just focus on that sentence. If I click import all, then this will be removed. This will be added. This will be changed. I think that's it. Well, I'm over. All right. Any questions?
So helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Cool. Thank you. Good questions. Questions. Yeah.
Do you have any tips or like, so multi-site, so Drupal 7, you know, you have the all.
Yeah. Don't use multi-site. Any other questions?
So like,
Config split.
okay, so we're using a big split. I just wanted to make sure we're
Yeah.
on the right path.
I love config split.
Okay.
But again, you got to be using it the right way.
You know, like the settings for every single site, we still have to include that sync folder in every single site settings. Every site, right? There's no automatic.
Yeah.
You can't have an all like folder and then a set.
Because all multi-site is, it's it's the same code base with a different database. So as far as Drupal's concerned, they're different sites completely. So there's some tricks with multi-site to share the users table and stuff, but there's nothing for that like that for config.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.